one tiny little detail I always like about your biography, that it says that you were born in the desert. And actually, if you read Forrest's poems, there's some desert in there sometimes. But he grew up in Virginia and spent some time in various places, among them Mexico. And he then taught, I guess, some generations of aspiring poets and translators also at Brown University at the east coast of the United States. But he now moved back a few years ago, back to California, where he lives now. Forrest wrote about, I think, 14 collections of poetry. One of them we have here for the audience here in the room. That's Be With. That's the volume that appeared last. And for this volume, Forrest received the Pulitzer Prize for poetry. But he also writes essays and novels, and of course is an eminent translator from various languages. He works with artists, photographers, ceramic artists, dancers, musicians. So Forrest likes to, that's actually also a question whether that's also some kind of translation then between the arts. So he likes to collaborate with other artists from other fields. And his own translations, I think it's only poetry or mostly poetry at least.
Mostly poetry.
Mostly poetry. A lot from Spanish, of course. And Jaime Saenz, Pablo Neruda, Alfonso D'Aquino, Bracho, Pura López Colomé. Probably there are more. Then also from, and I guess we'll talk about that, from Japanese, Kiwao Nomura and Gozo Yoshimasu, who actually, because Forrest and I, we met in 2002 here in Berlin at the Literature Festival, and I looked it up today, and Gozo Yoshimasu was here as well. Was that when you met?
It is. It's when we met. It was a good story to tell.
It's, well, we don't really have so much time, but maybe it's there. Well, we talk about Gozo, I guess. Also, he's featured in your talk. So Spanish and Japanese, and then also Slovenian and French. But those were, I guess, collaborations with other people, because I don't know how good your Slovenian actually is.
Not so good.
Forrest also translated and added some anthologies, poems from Latin America and from Spain with the fantastic title Panic Cure, Poems from Spain for the 21st Century. And that's also a volume that he edited. And his own work has been translated into numerous languages, also into German, but there was, I think, a novel was translated into German. But yeah, poetry, of course, was translated for the festival here. And who wants to zoom in tonight? There's a poetry night with different poets, and that was recorded before the festival, and you can stream that at 9 p.m. And then you can listen to Forrest reading his marvelous poetry, and also in German translation by Ron Winkler. And Forrest is also, so he has been awarded many, many awards and scholarships and so on. And one thing that I didn't know, but you are also a chancellor for the Academy of American Poets. And one cute little detail that they say on their website is all these chancellors for the Academy of American Poets means that you serve as an ambassador for poetry. That's a nice title, I guess.
Yeah. Maybe all poets are ambassadors for poetry.
Yeah, but does poetry really need ambassadors? Well, that's a different question, maybe. That's a different question. And before you give us your talk, I have one question for you. So, what in your writing life, what came first, the translation or writing?
So maybe the good writing only came after translation, but I started writing, like most people do, early on with a lot of bad poems. when I was in college, I showed my poems to my first year teacher who said, Forrest, these are terrible.
Was he really a person to judge, who knew that, who could judge that?
He made me rethink what I was doing. It was a good
Yeah.
critique. But it wasn't until I began translating that maybe I began writing better poems.
And there was why our mutual friend Elliot Weinberger said that that in translating poetry, the good thing is that you can actually concentrate on the language and not so much and not think about the content. Would you say that was also one thing that you learned by translating?
There's a whole lot that I learned from translating, from a whole different palette of lexicon and syntactical usages and images, but mainly a kind of flexibility in the Spanish language that English didn't have, that my English was informed by through my work as a translator. And it's the translators, I imagine in the audience, there are a lot of translators. It's my favorite company. When the plane goes down, I want to be with the translators.
To talk about some new discoveries in your last moment. That's nice. We'll take. Okay, so are you ready to give us your talk? So I will leave. I will leave the stage and I'll come back afterwards. So
to talk about translation, I'd like to begin with a translation that maybe we can all do together there in the room, just to look at the dimensions of what it takes to translate even a very small poem. So the poet Robert Hass introduced me to this Oglala Sioux poem song. It goes, Ike size wayon kon he, wana hena la yelo he, iyo tie kia wayon. And thank you for the visual. This is a poem composed by Tatanka Yontake, Sitting Bull, in the Lakota language, as it was recited by the Lakota informant named Used as a Shield for an ethnomusicologist named Francis Densmore in 1914, which was 24 years after the assassination of Sitting Bull, who was a great warrior and holy man and healer of the Lakota people. He composes this song after the return of the Oglala Sioux to the United States from Canada, where they had fled after they defeated the US cavalry at Wounded Knee. And then the tribe was reduced to starvation by 2 hard winters hiding in the Canadian plains. Tatanka Yontake, or Sitting Bull, led his people back to the US and negotiated their surrender and their settlement on a reservation. He returned to his people and recited this poem that you can see. And now maybe the next visual. So Ikesize, head warrior, literally one who confronts face to face. Wayon means to know or to know how. Kon, to want. He is a so-called meaningless terminal rhythmic syllable, but it's an intensifier. Such intensifiers are really common in Scandinavian languages. Wana, now, hinala, all gone. Next slide. Yelo is a stress particle following hinala, could be translated as indeed or not translated. Iotie, to suffer, to find difficult, literally to crash against something. Kia, an auxiliary verb meaning to make be. Wayon, you already know from the first line, to know or to know how, but now I want to tell you that the nickname for bears in Lakota, Wyonze, derives from Wyatt, and bears were considered wise healers and warriors with powerful hearts. So if we wanted to quickly do a translation, it might be something like, head warrior, know how to want, hey, now all gone, hey, to suffer and to make to know how. Or perhaps, I knew how to be or how to want to be a head warrior, to confront things face to face. Hey, now that is all gone. Hey, and I now know how to be made to suffer or to crash against things. But now I want to complicate that translation, because remember, this poem was recited, not written. And Densmore, the musicologist who wrote it down, he's a musicologist. So he scores the tonal pattern in the key of E flat with a minor descending fourth and two cascading thirds, which he notes is something like the prophetic meadowlark's song. The Western meadowlark in the United States is one of the most musical of our birds. And it turns out that Sitting Bull's oracle was the Western meadowlark, which from childhood warned him of danger. So at this point, let's listen to a Western meadowlark. Can you play that there? Ikke size wan kon he. Ikke size wan kon he. Ikke size wan kon he. So here's Francis Densmore's translation. A warrior I have been, now it is all over, a hard time I have. Kenneth Lincoln tries to preserve an echo of the Lakota feeling for bears with an English pun. He goes, so I have been a warrior and now it is all over, so I know how to bear against hard times, the pun in English. Neither of those translations brings into English the intensifying sound of hey. But Lincoln at least uses two occasions of so to perhaps approximate that intensification. But if we want to translate this poem, we'll need to account for the sound pattern and how to reveal the relationship of the music of the poem and the song of the meadowlark, which Sitting Bull's original audience all would have recognized. Now, you all do a translation of the poem in the next minute. All right, time's up. Many years ago, I landed a job at Harvard University for which I was interviewed by the famous American poetry critic Helen Vendler, who asked me, after looking at examples of my projected syllabi, how I could teach books of translation to students who are not even thoroughly familiar with their own, by which she meant British and North American literary tradition. But the notion that literary tradition might be squished between geographic boundaries seems to me a constructed, unhealthy conceptual convenience, and one that runs the danger of advocating a kind of academic feudalism. I don't believe writers care where their influences come from. They're alert for images, rhythms, forms, anything at all that will feed the burning tree. I think readers are the same. Chaucer had his ear tuned to French poetry before he shifted the rhythm of his own lines from tetrameter to pentameter. Shakespeare cribbed more than once from Arthur Golding's translation of Ovid. For George Herbert and Henry Vaughan, two great English poets, the translation of the Bible they read was a matter of the utmost seriousness. Keats, as you may know, penned an ecstatic poem to honor Chapman's translation of Homer, and Gerard Manley Hopkins, one of my favorite poets, when he wrote The Wreck of the Deutschland, had Pindar in mind. There are, of course, political ramifications to crossing linguistic borders. Each language is a modality of life. We might go so far as to say that one form of totalitarianism is the stuffing of expression into a single standardized language that marches the reader towards some presumptively shared goal. If my country's self-assurance, its reliance on a grammar of linearity and commerce, its obsessive valuation of measurement and scientific objectivity, brackets off realms of perception, of possibility, and of difference, then translation offers refreshment. It shifts our perspective and realigns our relation to the world, bringing us into proximity with other modalities, with others. It can draw us across that most guarded border, the one we build around ourselves. It's instructive to ask what comes across to us in a translation from a language that disappeared from the earth more than 2,000 years ago, from a poetry that was written in quantitative verse, which means it's length-based, which means it doesn't translate readily into the stress-based meters of English. Mary Barnard brought the Greek poet Sappho's work to a large public in translations that didn't make any attempt to duplicate the hendecasyllabic verses or the choriamb, the long, short, short, long, which is the heart of the Sapphic line. Barnard's translations also included fill-in lines, her guesses about what must have been there. Early English translations of Chinese poems with their own particular tones and rhythmic patterns were often rendered as end-rhyming English quatrains, because that's what poems were expected to look like to 19th and early 20th century North American readers. Ezra Pound was the first to translate a Sapphic fragment as a viable whole poem in Lustra in 1916. He translates, and I think we have a visual of this, do we? Yeah. Spring, too long, Gongula, where Gongula is a woman's name. Now I can feel the longing in that poem, in its shredded form, in this fantastic distance from the language and the culture in which it made sense. It can still move me. Translation has given me this gift. But we might ask, what really of Sappho has it given me? In what way does it respect the original? This is a question I'm going to keep coming back to. Nietzsche called Roman translations of Greek a form of conquest, because the Romans filled their translations of Greek poems with their own loose interpretations, variations, improvisations, and erasures. Early translations were often liberal rewritings. Without copyrights or intellectual property law, writing was considered a common inheritance. In fact, most of the 16th century English poet Thomas Wyatt's memorable poems are variations on his translations of poems by others, including most famously Petrarch. Let's take a quick look at a Wyatt and a Petrarch poem. Because my old Italian isn't very good, I'm going to read the English translation of the Petrarch poem by Anna Maria Armi. A pure white doe in an emerald glade. And I want you to notice that we're starting with a vision of the doe, of the deer. There's a focus on the deer at the start. A pure white doe in an emerald glade appeared to me with two antlers of gold, between two streams under a laurel's shade, at sunrise in the season's bitter cold. Her sight was so suavely merciless that I left work to follow her at leisure, like the miser who, looking for his treasure, sweetens with that delight is bitterness. Around her lovely neck, do not touch me, was written with topaz, which I want to tell you in Petrarch's time, topaz is a gem that symbolizes chastity, and diamond stone. My Caesar's will has been to make me free. Already noon had climbed the sun. My weary eyes were not sated to see when I fell in the stream and she was gone. So it's a vision of seeing this image of transcendent beauty and then losing it again. But look what Thomas Wyatt does with this translation in the poem that he makes of it. And he's writing a poem because he's in love with Anne Boleyn in King Henry VIII's court. And he's been having an affair with Anne Boleyn. And the king has taken to Anne Boleyn. And so Thomas Wyatt has to give her up. So he writes this poem, Whoso lists to hunt. Whoso lists to hunt, I know where is a hind. A hind is an old word for a deer. But notice that already Wyatt's poem is focused not on the deer, but on those who are hunting the deer. So it's like, boys, if you're looking for this babe of a deer, I've got some news for you, brothers. But for me, as for me, alas, I may no more. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore. I am of those that furthest come behind. So I can't keep up with the people who are pursuing this deer. Yet may I by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer, but I can't stop thinking about her. But as she fleeth afore fainting I follow. I leave off therefore, since in a net I seek to hold the wind. Who list her hunt I put him out of doubt, as well as I may spend his time in vain. And graven with diamonds in letters plain. Notice chastity has been left out of this description because Anne Boleyn has been sleeping with Wyatt and now sleeping with the king. Engraven with diamonds in letters plain, there is written her fair neck round about, noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am. And that's now Henry VIII. And wild for to hold, though I seem tame. That ending is incredible in English, that wild for to hold. It's so riveting because wild has several connotations in English. It can suggest untamed as well as erotic, unrestrained. In Spanish, for comparison, wild doesn't have the same connotations. It might be translated as salvaje, feroz, descontrolado, frenético, none of them carrying the degree of erotic suggestion that the English has. Similarly, a word based on wild, wilderness, has a positive connotation in English, where we see untamed forest, the majesty of nature. But in Spanish, wilderness is almost always a negative thing, an absence. Desierto, yermo, páramo. Historically, translation theory seems to move from the early acceptance of what came to be called predation of original words and forms, as perhaps Wyatt's poem preys on the Italian sonnet, towards what people call a respect for original forms and words. But what I'm asking you is, what does it mean to respect original forms and words? And what about, for instance, in a work like Tale of Genji, when there is no original? A horse neighs in English, but in Chinese, it might go xiao xiao. Just as people see things differently, in Mexico, if you ask children what they see in the full moon, they'll say they see a rabbit playing a guitar. In the United States, children see the face of a man. In different cultures, people hear sounds differently also. Even incidental sounds that we make are culturally patterned. So that when filling in blank moments in speech, the Japanese will say ito, ano, Americans will say or British or Spanish and Hebrew say also in Mexico, como and ete. In Arabic, it's yani, it is. Do you think a Japanese ito can be translated as an American What does it mean to respect original words? Aren't words sounds? End rhyme and meter are still common features in contemporary poetry, in Russian contemporary poetry. But what happens for our respect for original form if in the original Russian, which is a highly inflected language that allows for a wide variety of word order in any given sentence, rhyming words can have various grammatical functions. But in English, they're almost necessarily translated into noun-to-noun rhymes that sound, to Russians, contemptibly amateurish. Sophocles' Antigone, verse 20, has been translated into English as, "What's the matter? Something is bothering you, clearly." And by another translator as, "What is it? The way you look makes it seem you're thinking of something dark and gloomy." Frederick Holderlin translates a first Greek meaning by which bother indicates a dark complexion, the color purple. He translates the same line in the further English translation. "What is it? You seem to paint a purple word." He's translating a first meaning which would have been overlooked by the Greeks of Sophocles' time, revealing the originary element of the original text. And that's like translating the Spanish for "we're marrying," nos casamos, as "we're housing together," since the word casa is embedded in a word that has come to mean to marry. And this is basically what Ezra Pound and Ernest Fenollosa do with Chinese ideograms. As everyone in the room, I'm sure, knows, Fenollosa's notes suggest that the Chinese character, say for east, is essentially a superposition of the characters for tree and sun. That is a picture of the sun tangled in a tree's branches, suggesting sunrise, which occurs in the east. This is, incidentally, a misinterpretation of the nature of Chinese writing. But despite this misinterpretation, Wei Lim Yip and Zaming Qian are two among many literary critics who argue that Ezra Pound comes nearer than more informed and fluent translators of the spirit of the originals. The language of the South American Aymara interests me in particular because I've co-translated two books by the Bolivian poet Jaime Saenz, whose daughter lives in Germany, incidentally, whose work is notably influenced by the Aymara language and culture. The Aymara come from an ancient temple-building people. Their history predates Inca civilization by 500 years. Their empire has outlasted it for nearly as long. Today, the Aymara comprise a quarter of Bolivia's population and reside mainly in the country's oxygen-thin western highlands. In Aymara, it's impossible to say something like, "Chancellor Otto von Bismarck unified disparate German states in 1871. You can't even say that, since that statement is unqualified by anyone's experience, and because every sentence in Aymara must express whether an action or an event was personally witnessed or not. For the Aymara, the past is linguistically and conceptually in front of the people, while the future lies behind them. To speak of the future, elderly Aymara will thumb or wave backward over their shoulder. To reference the past, they make forward sweeping motions with their hands and arms. The main word for eye, front, and sight in Aymara means the past, while the basic word for back or behind also means the future. It's been suggested that in a culture that places a premium on stipulating degrees of evidential investment, that is, distinguishing the observed from the unobserved, the known from the unknown, it makes sense to metaphorically position the past in your field of vision, while the future, which is always speculative, remains invisible behind you. In this case, and others, like the widely publicized research of Daniel Everett on the Piraha, there seems to be a close relation between the particularities of language and the perceptions and conceptions of the speakers of that language. Here's the Bolivian poet Jaime Saenz channeling an Aymara spiritual regard for the harmony of opposites into a poetic philosophical grammar. What is the night, you ask now and forever? The night, a revelation still veiled, perhaps a death form, tenacious, flexed, perhaps a body lost to the night itself. Truly a chasm, a space unimaginable, a subtle, lightless realm not unlike the body dwelling in you, which hides surely many clues to the night. One time I came close to my body, and realizing I had never seen it, even though I bore it with me, I asked it who it was, and a voice in the silence said to me, I am the body who inhabits you, and I am here in the darkness, and I suffer you, and I live you, and I die you, but I am not your body. I am the night. Here's another example of a translation needing to deal with the way culture inhabits grammar. San Juan de Yepes, St. John of the Cross writes, Éntreme donde no supe, y quédeme no sabiendo, toda ciencia trascendiendo. In English, we might translate it as, I entered into unknowing and remained there without knowing, rising above all science. But if we did so, I say we would miss something critical in the way that conception and grammar work in Spanish. In the English language Bible, the book of John commences, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In Spanish, the word for word is palabra. But in the Spanish Bible, the passage is rendered, en el principio era el verbo, y el verbo era con Dios, y el verbo era Dios. In Spanish, God isn't a word, but a verb. St. John of the Cross might have started with a pronoun. Instead of entré, he could have said, yo entré, or he entrado. But instead, he begins with a verb, entré, because at least in part, St. John of the Cross believes that God always comes first. God begins everything. God, the verb, determines the sentence, including the sentence of Juan de Yepes' life. Let's take a look at a contemporary language writer and see if we can translate one line of his work. Alfonso de Quino. He's a poet who lives in Cuernavaca, Mexico, where the vegetation is really jungly and the electricity goes out for days at a time. He knows the snakes and the lizards doing push-up on the rocks in his garden. He collects local plants. He knows their medicinal uses. Octavio Paz recognized him when he was 22 and he was awarded the Carlos Pulitzer Poetry Prize. But he stayed clear of the circles of poets who live by and large in Mexico City. How might we approach a translation of his poetry? We'll start with this simple line. Lo interminable verde, planas de plantas, caligrafía regal. If we translate those words into the English words most similar to them, we would have lo interminable, that interminable verde. We have verdure or verdance. Planas de plantas, plains of plants. Caligrafía regal, calligraphy. Regal, that's a rare word even in Spanish. It means relative to the root. It can, if you and I are chopping down trees and I want you to do more work, when we're carrying the trunk, I'll ask you to carry the regal, which is the section of the trunk closest to the roots, which is going to be bigger and heavier. So in English, we have raceme or radical. So we could translate lo interminable verde, planas de plantas, caligrafía regal as that interminable verdure, plains of plants, calligraphic raceme. But that would be a pretty bad translation. And this has to do, the reason it's bad is because of the history of English and its relation with Anglo-Saxon and Latinate words. As most of you know, in 1066 AD, with the Norman conquest, the English language saw an influx of words from the French. And for centuries afterwards, French was the language spoken by the English ruling classes and was the official language of the royal court, whereas Anglo-Saxon was relegated to the lower classes. We can still see that class distinction in the way nouns for meats are commonly different from and unrelated to those for the animals from which the meat comes. With the animal commonly having a Germanic name, but the meat having a French name. So the animal is a deer, but the meat is venison. The animal is a cow or ox, but the meat is Old French, beef. The animal is a swine, but the meat is Old French, pork. Anglo-Saxons weren't eating the meat, only the French-speaking aristocracy was. This means also that the English language contains an unusual number of synonyms, and that for many Anglo-Saxon derived words, we can find a Latinate equivalent. You all know this. In the Germanic, the Anglo-Saxon, we have anger and wrath. What would the Latinate be? Rage, ire. Anglo-Saxon, bodily, Latinate, corporal, brotherly, fraternal, leave. What's leave in Latin? The egress, exit, depart. Anglo-Saxon, thinking, Latin, pensive, dog, canine, come, arrive, ask, inquire. As a general rule, words derived from Germanic ancestors are shorter, more concrete, and more direct. Another way to translate that line from D'Aquino would be to use non-Latinate words, not that interminable verdure, plains of plants, calligraphic raceme, but instead of interminable, an Old English German word, endless. Instead of verdure, we go for the Saxon groni, green. Instead of plains, we could do the Germanic or Frisian grasslands, or Spanish pampas, or steppes, Russian and German. Instead of plants, it could be the Old English shrubs, or greenery, which is Saxon. Instead of calligraphic, it could be the Germanic hand, or the Old Frisian, writing, written. Instead of raceme, we could have root, Scandinavian, or end, which is Old English and German. So an Anglo-Saxon-based version could be that endless green, steppes of shrubs, handwritten root. Maybe what works best for a translation will always be a combination of Latinate and non-Latinate choices in English. I think that's about my 31 minutes. I wanted to talk a little bit about this man that Beatrice Faßbender mentioned, Gozo Yoshimasu is one of Japan's most influential poets. It's been said over and over that his poems are untranslatable. And they seem to be, if you simply translate for semantic reading. But if you look at the text up there, you can see that a lot more than semantics is going on with his work. I worked for several years gathering together some hotshot translators to translate his work into English in a non-conventional way that allowed for the polyvocality and open-endedness of his work. Some readers questioned whether those innovative translations, once again, do they represent the original? But I wonder if the goal of representing the original is the goal of translation at all, given that the work is necessarily subjected to alteration, transformation, dislocation, and displacement. And given that transformation and displacement are major concerns in Gozo's work, maybe there are times when not representing the original is precisely what permits the creation of something less definitive, but more ongoing, a form of translation that amplifies and renews the suppleness of the original poetry's meanings. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Forrest. I guess there's a lot to think about in that talk of yours. Funny enough, now that you left out the Gozo part of your talk, there was one sentence in that part, because I actually got to read this talk beforehand, of course, and there was one sentence that I just loved, and I thought I'll pin that, above, I don't know where, above my desk or something. All poems are untranslatable until the right translator shows up. And I just love that, and I think it's that's so true, because you just need this. Well, I do translations of my own, and I've experienced that a few times with poems that I really love, but I just couldn't. They weren't mine to translate, and but somebody else might. And so it's so funny when you because I'm not a poet myself, but so when I tell people that I sometimes translate poetry, then it's always this questions. Oh, you can't translate poetry, and I always say no. I just have like this, I don't know, maybe one or two poets that where I think, yes, I have a language for that, but that doesn't mean that I know any other translation of poetry.
And that can serve as a really good advice for young translators, which is translate only what you love. Don't translate because you've been assigned something or because of some other reason, but go because you've loved it. I haven't always done that, so I've regretted some of my translations. And something I admire about Elliot Weinberger, his whole career in translation, was that he chose beautiful projects that he really loved.
And with Eliot, now that you mention him again, because I translated this weird book, well, it's a wonderful book of his about literary translation, and it's called 19 Ways of Looking at Wang Wai. And that is also one thing that, of course, it's all these Gozo, what's in your Gozo part of the talk that made me think about that, that you suggest, well, maybe there's not one translation of one poem, so maybe you have to get together many authors or many translators to give us different versions of one single poem in order to really make the reader get the poem, or to just present everything that is in there, or a few things that are in there. And because in Eliot's book he presents one Chinese poem of 4 lines, and then all the many translations that have been rendered in English. And that's, yeah, I don't know. I guess we don't really see that so often, do we?
No, we don't. And that's what I made the focus of that Alice Iris Red Horse, the Gozo book, is that the translators, sometimes translating the same poem, sometimes different poems, are all approaching from a different angle. Some giving precedence to music, some giving precedence to the way that Japanese characters can have homophonic and visual suggestions that don't happen usually in English, and some following up on other aspects of his work.
You called your talk ethical dilemmas in the translation of poetry into English, and this question of ethical questions when it comes to translation. There's one thing, and maybe it's a completely stupid question, but I've been thinking about that, because there's so much talk about cultural appropriation right now. Of course, also in other fields, in music, for example, pop music, or in all other fields of culture. Is there a problem, or is there a question of cultural appropriation in translation? I thought about that when you also had this example of the, what was it, a Sitting Bull poem. So I thought about this question, is that also an ethical question? Who translates what?
Of course it is. Of course it is. And there have been writers, I can name sort of Caribbean writers, who have not wanted to have their work translated, that feel like their community, and also I've met writers in India who feel this way. Their community of readers is the community that speaks that particular language. And yet most writers have wanted their work to have larger audiences. But the way that the translator controls that work or remains humble to it can be very various. A translation that sounds like the translator's own work and not like someone else's work is a translation that's been appropriated in some ways. And I think that a translator has to be very concerned with the ethics of translation, with what you're taking out, what you're losing, and how you're representing that, and whether you're representing that as just another manifestation of your own language.
It's also because you sort of, as a translator, you grab somebody else's work, and then you put your own, you use that thought, and then you present yourself. I mean, because there's also the translator's ego.
And that's what. So you and I, we haven't really, because we were in more communication before you began translating so much. So we haven't talked about this.
No,
I'm really interested in what, how it works for you. For me, I think of translation being an ethical activity, in part because I think the ego has to disappear at first in the translator. Because unless you can leave yourself and hear the music in someone else's mind, which is to listen as intently as it's humanly possible to listen, to move into someone else's consciousness and mind, unless you disappear like that, which is a sublimation of the self, which is a kind of religious experience, you're not a good translator. But then you have to use your ego, all of your talent, to come back with whatever you know to try to make that happen in your language. What about for you, Beatrice?
Well, this is about you, but I think I mean, you know, I learned well from Eliot, obviously, and from you as well. So that's, I guess, also where, I mean, this line. Well, I heard it first from Elliot Weinberger that a bad translation is where you hear the translator, and so it's. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I guess we're pretty much on the same page. And one thing that I thought about now, also when I listen to you, it's one crucial question that I've always been thinking about when it comes to poetry, and not only poetry in translation, but poetry just in general, and maybe it's also a question then that's more important even for poetry in translation, which is how much do you need to know, or actually, yeah, how much do you need to know, and what does it mean to really understand a poem? So, do you need all this information? Do you need to know in which context this one poem was written? And does it really, is that a knowledge that you need as a translator? Because sometimes it can actually maybe hinder you to understand a poem. There have been, there are two essays, and I won't go into detail, but there are two essays in German, and it's about Paul Celan and understanding. When one essay you actually get all the information about where this was written, what Celan is referring to, etc., etc. So you know all that, but then it doesn't help you, and it just gets flat. But I always thought that maybe as a translator, this is still something that you need to know, and then you sort of have to forget about it when you actually translate that.
Well, you slyly answered your own question in a very good way, and one I agree with. I mean, if you read what Nabokov writes about translation, you could never do a translation because you have to know the entire history, the depth of another culture. You have to know everything about the language. You're never going to make yourself the writer as a translator. You're never going to know everything that went into that writer's mind. Of course, it helps to know as much as you can. I couldn't have translated Jaime Saenz so well if I hadn't gone to Bolivia and La Paz and walked in his neighborhoods and spoken to the people who knew him and heard that very particular kind of Spanish that's spoken in the streets in Bolivia. On the other hand, some of the worst translations have been done by people who are completely fluent and have a very academic approach to research. I think that those academic approaches to translation produce very interesting documents, but they don't necessarily produce art. And I think as a poet, I think the most important thing you can have as a translator of poetry is a mind for poetry. How does poetry work?
I just want to look at the audience here because we started a little late, so we can also end a little late. Are there questions in here? Yes, it's a question kind of related to the previous discussions. How would you describe the innate value of poetry, recognizable across languages?
So the fascinating thing for me about poetry, an anthropologist told me once that there are three things that every culture that's ever been studied have in common. That human cultures will treat the dead with some special way. We don't just let our dead drop and then walk over them. We have rituals as early as maybe Neanderthals. We also have human cultures seem to develop some kind of rule about incest. And every human culture that's been studied has had a form of poetry. that it's been connected to shamanism, to healing, to vision, to the most essential parts of what it means to be human. I think across languages, poetry serves a function and does even now in an age of spectacle, when we're bombarded by images, when a lot of people aren't capable of reading more than Twitter feeds, that poetry is still drawing. In the United States, they just did a survey. There are more people reading poetry now than ever before, especially young people, and especially young people of color. And I think that has to do with the fact that poetry in every culture is provides something that's connected to our souls, an amplitude, a way of imagining, a way of feeling articulate language for our most subtle emotions.
So what about this theory that in times of political crises there's more translation, or like the more nationalistic a government gets, the more or the stronger the urge to read translations? Have you seen any, I don't know, a surge in translations in the last 4 years in the United States?
Well, actually, starting with the Bush administration, when we had a president who really couldn't speak one language, there was suddenly a shift in the United States. Famously, in the United States, only 3% of publications, of all publications, academic, scholarly, literary, only 3% were translations that were published here, which is a tiny, minuscule, and compared to Germany or Iceland or Slovenia. But since the Bush administration, and increasingly now, there has been more money for translation, more interest in translation, more prizes for translation, and more attention to translation. And I think that has to do with a kind of waking up to how we're involved with others, which is, which is what the 21st century is about, that no one is standing independent, not even independent of other human cultures, but independent of other species. Do any of the smart translators in the audience?
I don't know, are there any translators in this room? Yes, what, two, and one of them just asked you a question.
Oh.
Well, Forrest, we are actually a little bit over the time, so you'll have to come back next year when there's a more physical festival, maybe. Even though I must say I'm really grateful for this coronavirus to hit us in a time when we can talk. We can, you are in California, we're in Berlin, and we're able to share this time together. So that's friendly of the coronavirus. Thank you for that. And Forrest, thank you so much for being here with us, for sharing this talk, and for sending us home with many things to think about, I think. So
thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Beatrice.
Well, thank you. So that's it. Bye, Forrest.